Okay, so today I want to talk about poetry. Because I just wrote a bunch. I just wrote some few, poems because it's Sunday, which is for me my worship day for Apollo, as I've mentioned before. And one of the potential things I do is I write poetry, ideally with a pen and paper, so not on my phone or anything, and by candlelight, just for ambiance. And I just did that, so I thought I would actually talk a bit about it, because I actually find the process of how I write poetry and how it is for me and kind of my journey with it almost kind of interesting. I honestly often find aspects of myself and my brain interesting, so I'm gonna talk about it. So in the beginning, when I first started being somewhat interested in potentially writing poetry, I did mostly actually think about doing poetry because of my Apollo worship, since Apollo is one of the gods of poetry, and I've always kind of admired poetry, so I wanted to start with it. But at the very beginning, it often felt very, I don't quite know how to explain it. It felt very foreign, very far away from me, like almost untouchable. Like it had such elegance and beauty to it that I felt like I could never capture something like that. And in the beginning, it was a lot of just plain statements that I wrote. I just wrote basically facts, just lists of facts or questions, which is honestly, I think, a valid way to start. But then eventually I started writing down some feelings. Still in the beginning, a lot of fact statements of I feel this way and it affects me in this way, you know, more like therapy notes than poems. But I think it was actually a good way for me to actually get into it a little bit more, because something that when I started was terrifying to me about poetry, and I think kind of is for many people, is that it's a very vulnerable and raw way of expressing feelings, and it really encourages you to bear out the deepest pits of your heart. Now, obviously you can do poetry without getting that deep, but I think, for me personally, that's not the spirit of things. For me, poetry is something very personal and very emotional. So, yeah, I started to get deeper into it. I still write for romantic partners about romantic things, which is interesting because sometimes, like, while I'm in a mood, I just like wrote down some raw, like, really just trying to put my weird feelings to my partner into words, and then later I read it back and was like, this sounds like the most generic shit ever. This only happened like once or twice. Mostly my poems are actually quite specific. But this happened because it basically made me understand why it was like a generic or like common thing. Because it's a feeling that is very difficult to really express the magnitude of. So it can sound just like bland and generic when you say it, but it's really deeply meant. And that's one of the other things about poetry that can be difficult, and was definitely for me, which was feeling cringe or feeling like you're not being original enough or something like that, which I think you kind of have to just ignore that entirely and not be worried about being original or even being good, honestly. I think if you write poetry, especially in the beginning, but also in general, you should not generally worry about it being good. It's supposed to be a intense version of emotional expression, at least in my opinion. And for me, I have recently become more able to express these things with symbolism and very like vivid visual representation of emotions. I'm also a big fan of, like, for example, like Victorian speech patterns and things like that. So often my poems read like I'm trying to, like, like I'm writing for a Renaissance fair basically. Because I really enjoy doing that. And the only person who has not immediately become sick of me, like, talking like that over chat was my partner, who said they actually enjoy it, which is hard for me to believe. I think it's actually really annoying for me, because I've never had anyone else do this, but I do this, to actually talk in those ways. So I usually keep it to poetry. And it's like very extravagant, very metaphorical wording and stuff. And it's like, very often like to have this direct connections, or like use very physical things for very emotional topics. One that is a kind of a classic, but I also really enjoy using is blood language, like words that are usually used for blood, or even specifically mentioning blood, to express emotions. Now, I do tend to do this, I think, a bit differently than many people do, because I'm a big fan of the visual and imagery of blood. Actually, I like getting my blood taken at the doctor's office is one of the most relaxing things for me, because I can see my own blood, and that's cool. Anyway, so like, and I use it in not necessarily like a very literal way. Like, I don't talk about it as like a live blood or something. But like, for example, one time I, to my partner, I described how I was talking as Venus, as like veins, which, you know, I couldn't directly, I think, explain, but to me it makes sense, which is like what 90% of my poems are. Things that don't directly actually make sense and that most people could not get behind, but that to me are correct and I cannot find any other words for it. And then other times it's like a very just internal view, like more of a talk. Sometimes the poetry is more of talking about how like life is in my perspective, basically, which is really difficult to explain what I mean by that. But like generally when you talk to someone, have like a dialogue, a conversation, you try to understand their perspective and see the world as you both experience. It's like commonalities and things like that. And in poetry, sometimes I just like to describe what is for me that is also often nonsensical to other people. Like, a lot of the things I write are very nonsensical, and I think for me personally that is a sign that I'm doing it right. Because poetry, I try to put so much feeling and of my own heart into it that if it fully made sense to other people, like generally, then it's not quite right. Then it's a little too direct, a little too literal. Although I do sometimes try to kind of explain to myself why I used the terminology that I did, to just kind of almost work through it. So yeah, those are just a few thoughts from the top of my mind about poetry, because I think it's actually a fascinating topic. I could actually talk about it more, but I think this is quite enough for this time. Also, I got a less creaky chair now, so that's good. But yeah, just wanted to talk about it a little bit, and those are my thoughts. Those are my basic thoughts. I also have more thoughts, because I always do, but that's it for today. Bye.